The United States Capitol Historical Society began a process of, excuse me, doing our public webinars during the pandemic, as Sam spoke of. And what we found is once the pandemic moved away, we still continue the webinars because that allows us to reach a national audience and to bring speakers to you from throughout the country, and in fact, sometimes from throughout the world. We also decided that one of the things we wanted to do with these webinars was to mark important times, and the Holocaust Remembrance Day is one of those moments. The United Nations General Assembly created a Holocaust Memorial Day for designated January 27th as the day, which is the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. And so we join, not on that particular day, because there are very many things on that particular day, but close to it, to remember the 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust and the millions of other victims of Nazi persecution, because we do believe that understanding our history is what will allow us to build a more inclusive future. Right now, we are witnessing an alarming rise of anti-Semitism around the globe and here in the United States, which makes it all the more important to recognize the critical lessons of the Holocaust history as we commemorate the victims and honor the survivors. Our planned speaker for today is Dr. Katrina Lantos Swett. And she is a very interesting person in that her father and mother both are Holocaust survivors. Her father is the only Holocaust survivor ever to serve in the United States Congress, and she is currently the president of the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice. Her father, Congressman Tom Lantos, was a distinguished member of Congress, serving as the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and provided extraordinary leadership. And we are so grateful to have Dr. Katrina Lantos Swett with us today. Under her leadership, the Lantos Foundation has rapidly become a distinguished and respected voice on critical human rights concerns, ranging from advancing the rule of law globally to fighting for internet freedom in closed societies to combat the persistent and growing threat of anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial. Dr. Lantos Swett continues the strong legacy of her father. And if you look at that legacy, Congressman Tom Lantos founded the Congressional Human Rights Caucus, now known as the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, and was widely acknowledged to be one of our nation's most eloquent and forceful leaders on behalf of human rights and justice. But Dr. Lantos Swett is more than just somebody's daughter. She is somebody herself. Now, this young woman graduated from Yale University at the age of 18, 2.5 years later got her Juris Doctor from the University of California, Hastings School of Law, later getting a PhD in history from the University of Southern Denmark, and has been a true leader. And we are so honored to have you with us today to just have a conversation and reflect about, as we are here at Holocaust Remembrance Day, what was it like to grow up with two parents who might not have been there had the Nazis done what they wanted to do with them? So welcome, and give us some news. Tell us about your life.
Well, thank you so much, Jane. It's such an honor to be with you and really such a privilege. I can't tell you how grateful I am for this opportunity to have, as you say, a conversation as we all prepare to commemorate Holocaust Remembrance Day. As you have explained in your introduction, I am the daughter of the only Holocaust survivor ever to serve in the United States Congress. And my father, who served in Congress for nearly 3 decades, was, as you said, the co-founder of the Congressional Human Rights Caucus, which after his death was reconstituted as the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission of the Congress, and really devoted his service in Congress to fighting for the fundamental rights of persecuted people really around the globe. And I don't think there can be any doubt at all that the experiences of his youth, what he endured and what he experienced, played the pivotal role into turning him into somebody who became such an ardent champion for the rights of all people. So, as his daughter, I've always felt it was both a great privilege, but also a tremendous responsibility to try and carry forward this legacy. And I think it's fair to say I've felt that even more so since the terrible events of October 7th, when once again, not only did we witness an unimaginably savage attack on innocent people in Israel, but then we have seen a veritable tsunami of anti-Semitism exploding around the world, including here in our own country. And so this particular Holocaust Remembrance Day happens at a very, very important juncture, I think, for all of us, a moment when, yes, of course, we need and want to look back at the tragic lessons of history, but we also have to look in a very clear-eyed way at the dangers and challenges of today. But what I'd like to do sort of at the outset, if I can, with your audience, is to take you back with me to March 19th, 1944. That is the day when the Germans marched into Hungary and occupied the homeland of both of my parents, Tom and Annette Lantos. Now, for your participants, Hungary had been an ally of Germany during the Second World War. But as the war went on, as it became, I think, increasingly clear that Germany was losing ground, the Germans began to perceive Hungary, and rightly so, as a wavering ally. There were efforts on the part of the regent of Hungary, Horthy, to perhaps try and negotiate a separate peace with the Allies. And so Germany couldn't risk that, and they occupied Hungary. And that really is the day when the true nightmare for the Jewish community of Hungary began. Up until then, they had experienced discrimination. There had been laws passed. They were kicked out of schools. They were kicked out of professions. They were definitely already being severely discriminated against. I mean, Hungary was a fascist country allied with the Germans, but there had not been the mass deportations. But that began on March 19th, 1944. Now, my father, like tens and tens and tens of thousands of other Hungarian men, was initially sent to a slave labor camp outside of Budapest. And the conditions in these camps were horrific as well. Of the 100,000 Hungarian boys and men, and he was a teenage boy then, who were sent there, almost half perished. So these were very dangerous and horrible places. After several attempts, my father managed to escape, and he made his way back to Budapest. And in Budapest, he found a measure, and I say this very carefully, a measure of refuge in a so-called safe house. And again, I use those air quotes because safe could not really describe what this house was, but let me explain what was meant by a safe house. So these were buildings that had been rented by Raoul Wallenberg, who I'm going to talk about in a moment, who was a Swedish diplomat who had been sent to Hungary with funding from our government, from the American government, with one mission. He was not a sort of professional lifetime diplomat. He had been kind of recruited for this very special assignment. And the assignment was to try to do what he could to save as much of the remaining Jewish community as possible. The outlying Jewish community outside the capital of Budapest had largely been rounded up and deported to their deaths in a span of only about 8 weeks, some 450,000 Jews. It was probably the single most intense and most telescoped, fastest deportation of any Jewish community in the whole Holocaust. But the community in Budapest and the surrounding areas was still somewhat intact. So one of the things Wallenberg did when he got there is he rented properties. He hung the Swedish flag there and he put up a sign that said, "This building is part of the Swedish diplomatic legation and is under the protection of the Royal Swedish government." And then he packed them as full as he could of Jews and others who were seeking refuge from deportation and from death. And it is in one of those houses where my father found a measure of refuge. Now, he was blonde, he was blue-eyed, he looked quote unquote Aryan. And so in a stolen Arrow Cross uniform, and the Arrow Cross was sort of the homegrown Hungarian SS, he became part of the underground, moving around Budapest, delivering messages, delivering documents, and delivering medicines. He had a number of incredibly close calls. And if we had more time, it reads like his life story sort of reads, Jane, like a suspense novel in many ways. And I marvel when I think about some of the things he did to survive and to escape from moments of great danger. I think, oh my gosh, how did he have the presence of mind? How did he have the courage and the quick thinking, to escape death by mere moments? But he did, and of course, Hungary was liberated by the Russians, the Soviets, who were our allies in the war. But before I go on to tell sort of the rest of my father's story, I have to tell a little more about Raoul Wallenberg. As I said, he was a Swede who came to Hungary with the mission and the purpose of trying to rescue as much of the Hungarian Jewish community as possible. He didn't need to be there. He was from one of the richest and most powerful and influential families in Sweden. The Wallenbergs were sort of like the Rockefellers in the United States. He was not Jewish, he was a Protestant, and Sweden was a neutral country. And this young, courageous, remarkable humanitarian could have easily lived out the remainder of the war in the safety and security of his wealthy family's business in neutral Sweden. But he volunteered for this mission, which of course speaks volumes about the character of this individual. And he had so little in common with the people he went to save. He was rich, most of them were poor. He was privileged, they were persecuted. He was Christian, they were Jewish. But what he understood so powerfully was that they had a common bond of humanity, that they were, in a broader sense, his brothers and sisters, and he was ready to put his life on the line to save them. So he went to Hungary. He engaged it again, like another novel. I don't know if you've ever read or any of your listeners have ever read The Scarlet Pimpernel, but he was kind of like the Scarlet Pimpernel of Budapest. He seemed to be everywhere and had incredible ideas he came up with to sort of outsmart the Nazi death machine. He printed tens and tens of thousands of a document called the Schutzpass, which he sort of created out of thin air in many ways. It did not have really the sanction of the Swedish government. He went way outside the bounds of what they had said he could do. But this Schutzpass said that the bearer of that document had permission to emigrate to Sweden. And again, was under the protection of the Royal Swedish government. And remarkably, this little piece of paper was the means of saving thousands of lives. Whenever Wallenberg would hear about a train at the station ready to leave for the death camps in Poland, he would rush to the train station. He would demand from the SS officer in charge that he be allowed to go on the trains. He said, I have evidence that you have people under the protection of my government on that train. I demand the right to retrieve them. And he must have been a very charismatic individual. He was slight of build, but he had an inner strength that made him stand way more than 10 feet tall. And the Germans would let him go, and then he would rush to the trains and he'd walk along them, sometimes jump up on the top and call down, and he'd say, I'm Raoul Wallenberg. I'm here from the Swedish embassy. If you have a Schutzpass, come forward, come out. I will get you off this train. You're under my protection. And some of them did have Schutzpasses, but others of them understood, because he'd say, if you have any document at all indicating that you are authorized to emigrate to Sweden, let me see your documents. And they would begin to pull anything out of their pocket, a laundry ticket, anything, because of course the Germans couldn't read Hungarian. And he would examine them and he'd say, this person has papers, this person has papers. And of course, the tragedy was he couldn't save everybody, but from each train that he went to, he would pull off a few dozen, a few more lives saved. Whenever he heard of one of his safe houses being raided, if he could get there in time, he would kind of intimidate the German soldiers into freeing the prisoners that they were starting to march to the train stations, or of course to the banks of the Danube, where many were just shot. And that's what happened to my own grandfather. He was ultimately shot on the banks of the Danube River and his body thrown in there. So Wallenberg was an incredible hero. My mother says we called him our Moses from the North, our Moses from the North, who had come to free us and to take us to the promised land. So you've heard that old saying, no good deed goes unpunished. And tragically, Raoul Wallenberg was arrested by the Soviets after they succeeded in driving out the Germans and occupied Hungary and set up in Budapest. They feared him. They feared him in part because he had become a legend throughout all of Budapest. He had plans to sort of help build and establish a democratic, vibrant, free Hungary after the war. But of course, they knew they wanted Hungary to be in the Soviet sphere of influence. They suspected him because he had done his mission of rescue in part with funding from the United States. So in their minds, he was an American spy. Long story short, he was arrested by the Russians, disappeared into the Soviet gulag. And it was thought originally that he probably had died very shortly thereafter. But many years later, stories began to emerge from prisoners who had gotten out of Russia, who had been released after long sentences, bringing testimony saying, I met a Swede when I was there. He said his name was Wallenberg. He said, my only crime was saving Jews. Tell them I'm still alive. Tell them I'm still here. Some of those testimonies reached my mother, who also had been saved by Wallenberg. And she established a Free Wallenberg committee to try and lobby on his behalf to try and find out what had happened to him. So if we now fast forward to 1980, when my father was first elected to Congress, and that was another minor miracle in his life. Of course, the first miracle was surviving the unimaginable dangers that he faced in Hungary during the Holocaust. But he was elected in 1980, and some of your listeners will recall that that was the year of the Ronald Reagan landslide. And my dad was a Democrat, and lots of longtime Democrats were swept out of office, but my father became one of only 2 Democrats nationally to unseat an unindicted Republican incumbent. So there was a third guy who lost, but he was under indictment, so we didn't count that. We thought that wasn't an even playing field. And and so he was elected to Congress, and I loved what he said. He felt it was such an incredible reflection on his adopted country. He often referred to himself as an American by choice. But he said, it didn't say much about me that I got elected to Congress, but it spoke volumes about this country. That an immigrant, a refugee with a notable Hungarian accent, clearly, you know, came from no wealth, no power, no privilege, who had arrived in this country with $5 in his pocket, that his fellow citizens would give him the opportunity and grant him the great honor of representing them in Congress. He thought it was a beautiful and powerful reflection on what America is at its best. Um, but when he was elected to Congress, his very first act as a new member was to introduce legislation to make Raoul Wallenberg an honorary US citizen. Now, he had a couple of reasons for wanting to do this. The first was he wanted to empower the United States government to have more legitimacy and more of a platform to advocate and to demand information about what had happened to Wallenberg, to seek his release if he might still be alive, um, and if not, to demand a full accounting of what had happened to him. He also, of course, wanted to honor Wallenberg by bestowing this notable distinction on him. But I think my father also felt that the United States would be honored by being also associated with really a man who was one of the greatest heroes and humanitarians of the last century. The bill was adopted, signed into law by President Reagan. And when it was, Raoul Wallenberg became only the second person in American history to be so honored. And if this was my classroom, I'm a professor at Tufts University, I would say to my students, can anybody tell me who the other one was? And, then they're always scratching their head. But since we can't have that direct interaction right now, I'll share with our listeners. The other person so honored was also a remarkable figure from World War II. And that was Winston Churchill. But of course, his mother had been an American, so there was a little more of a connection, but it was really a great moment and a great honor. And I think it speaks to how profound my father's gratitude was to this individual who shone like a light in the darkness, at a time in his life where he had become a hunted animal in the country of his birth, where every day his life was in peril. But into that darkness came a light, and came someone who exemplified the very best of humanity. So I thought maybe I can stop there if you'd like, or I'd be happy to go on. But I sort of wanted to tell my family's Holocaust story. And it is a story of tragedy. So many of our family members were lost, but also a story of heroism, and also a story of humanity, and a story of one person shining, as I say, like a light in the darkness, being his brother and sister's keeper, and being prepared to make an enormous sacrifice to defend not only individual lives, but to defend our shared humanity, to defend our shared values that sort of make our civilization and our society and our communities worth living in. And so I take great inspiration both from the story of my father. As I say, he went on to be a great human rights leader in his own right. And of course, I take great inspiration from the story of Raoul Wallenberg. And both of them are kind of a constant presence in the life of all of us who work at the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice. We sort of measure what we're doing and hopefully the courage with which we're doing it against the pattern that they set for us. And, maybe I'll just close before we go to more of the question and answer and discussion part of this gathering by sharing with you my father's most famous quote. And it really does my heart good because it's quoted a lot. President Biden quoted it, I think 2 years ago on Holocaust Remembrance Day, and frequently former colleagues and colleagues whom he never knew, current members of Congress who he never knew personally, but who know of him will quote it. And that is, my father said, the veneer of civilization is paper thin. We are its guardians, and we can never rest. And that motto is, in our office. It is our guide. And what I liked about it is it alerts us that veneer is paper thin. There's always danger, there's always threat. But then it puts the responsibilities on our shoulders. We're the guardians. We are the ones who cannot rest. And so that is a wonderful motto and inspiration by which I try to live my life, try to run the affairs of the Lantos Foundation. So let me pause there, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions you may have or our listeners may have. And it's just so wonderful to be with you. Thank you so very much.
Dr. Swett, I tell you, you are a fabulous storyteller. And a couple of questions, but I also, before we get into the questions, I want you to, all of our listeners to know that there is a bust of Raoul Wallenberg in the Capitol Visitor Center, and we can show a picture of that. Here we go. So
Yes.
you see where it is?
Absolutely.
That is an extremely prominent place
Yeah.
for visitors, and you can see.
Well, I'm so grateful you have that wonderful picture for our viewers. My mother, who was absolutely an equal partner with my father in their human rights work, she was sort of the moving force behind getting that bust installed in the Capitol. And we are so grateful that it is, as you say, Jane, in such a prominent place. It's in Emancipation Hall. So all the millions of visitors who come there have the opportunity to see it. And the plaque tells, Wallenberg's story in brief. And, whenever I'm in Washington, I make my own little pilgrimage to the bust just to say thank you to this great man. There's a wonderful phrase that is shared in the Jewish tradition that says, "He who saves a single life, it's as if he had saved a whole world." And, I think about that often because Raoul Wallenberg saved my mother and my father. They married, they had 2 daughters. My sister and I both felt that in some ways, the best answer we could give to those who had tried to wipe our family and our people off the face of the earth was to have big families of our own. And so she has a big family, 10 children. I have 7 children. But what gave me a particular amazing kind of chills up and down my spine thrill was when my very first granddaughter was born. Her name is Nellie Hedquist, and Nellie was born on August 4th, which is Raoul Wallenberg's birthday. And so it also happens to be Barack Obama's birthday. So it's a powerful birthday, very wonderful, impressive people have been born on that birthday. But when my granddaughter Nellie was born, that phrase came into my mind that he had saved a world, our little world, and now my children and now my grandchildren. I have 16 grandchildren. And so truly, I go to thank him whenever I can when I'm in Washington.
What a great story. You talked about your mom, and I think maybe we need to hear a little bit more about your mom. We've heard about your dad, but what was your mom's experience, and how did your parents talk to you when you were kids? And kids always ask their parents, what was it like when you were, 12?
Yeah, yeah.
How did they have those conversations?
Wonderful questions. Well, in very brief, I'll share my mother's story more briefly, but we consider her as also having been saved by Wallenberg because he sort of recruited other members of the diplomatic corps to follow his lead in giving visas. And visas or Schutzpasses or documents were often literally the difference between life and death. My mother and her mother were able to get Portuguese visas, Portuguese passports, and they were able to escape on those. Her father, her grandparents tragically were not. Um, but but the question you ask of how did they talk to us about these events? I would say, first of all, we were kind of blessed, my sister and I, because since both of my parents felt that, there was this incredible person who had come from outside their country to rescue, to protect, to interpose himself between their would-be killers and themselves, there was always this underlying message of brotherhood and hopefulness and that conviction that one person can make a difference. So that was part of what they told us. It's also true, as I think many other children of Holocaust survivors know, my father did not want to talk too much about what he had been through. Many of the more difficult and terrible things we learned through letters he had written or through accounts that were shared with us by a very close friend of his who had also survived the Holocaust and who had been with him in the slave labor camp, and they had been very close friends. So it was not easy for him to talk about the difficult things. He talked about a lot. And my father was always, growing up with him was a little bit like a nonstop graduate level seminar in world history. Every dinner table conversation, it was geopolitics and, the battle between democracy and totalitarianism. And so he did like to talk about kind of the broader sweep of history. Harder to talk about the personal things, very hard for him to talk about the people he lost. But my mother, she told us the stories, but she also told us about Wallenberg's heroism, told us how it felt to have that Moses from the north who had come to rescue them.
And what would you say, you have dedicated your life to the Lantos Foundation, to keeping the hope alive, keeping the struggle alive to have real justice, inclusiveness. And what is the sort of lessons learned as we tell the Holocaust story for today?
Well, there are many, many lessons. And one of the things that I personally am very concerned about, I read a news article just yesterday, and maybe you have seen it as well, but they estimate that there are approximately, I think it was 240,000 Holocaust survivors who are still alive today. But the vast majority, I was surprised, it was more actually than I thought. But of course, the vast majority of those are in their late 80s into their mid 90s. My own mother, who lives with me and who is just fantastic, and I consider it a huge blessing, that we get to live together and spend these years together. She's 92. And so that generation is leaving the scene. So, one of the things that I feel is of incredible importance is that as that generation leaves us, that we find a way to keep the lessons and the reality of the Holocaust relevant and present for the upcoming generation. Another incredibly alarming news story of a few months back was a statistic, and I can't cite you precisely where it came from, but that something like a quarter of young people today, I think, defined probably 18 to 25, that sort of age range, didn't really know what the Holocaust was, or thought it hadn't happened, or, just were unbelievably unfamiliar with one of the most important events of the last century. Um, I know that a member of Congress who I have gotten to know quite well, Ro Khanna, who represents a similar part of the Bay Area Peninsula that my father represented. He's in the district just adjacent to the one my dad represented, has just introduced legislation calling on a dramatically beefed up federal support for Holocaust education and mandating Holocaust education for K through 12 students. And of course, it has to be age appropriate, and it has to be at the level that children can understand. But in the same way that we have an incredible moral duty and obligation to teach every American kid the story of slavery in the United States, the story of the struggle for women's rights, whatever issue it is, we have an absolute moral duty to make sure that once that generation is no longer with us to tell the stories themselves, that this is being taught, and the lessons of vigilance against hatred, vigilance against the othering of any group of people. One of the things we do at the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice is every year we give a Lantos Human Rights Prize, where we try to honor some hero of the human rights movement. And I would encourage everybody who's on the program to go and look at the list of fantastic people that we have honored: men, women, Christians, Muslims, Jews, secular people, just a huge range of people. But one of our honorees was Paul Rusesabagina, the hero of Hotel Rwanda. If anyone's seen that movie, he was the hotel manager who sheltered 1,200 Tutsis and moderate Hutus in his hotel, saving them from certain death at the hands of the genocidaires during the Rwandan genocide. An incredibly brave man. Again, sometimes no good deed goes unpunished. He was kidnapped and illegally rendered back to Rwanda by the current strongman dictator of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, put on trial in a kangaroo trial, sentenced basically to life in prison. He, was given a 25 or 28-year sentence. The Lantos Foundation was really the first into the breach to demand his release, to file global Magnitsky sanctions against the people involved in his kidnapping, to be part of an unrelenting campaign demanding his release. And it was one of the great joys of my life when he was released about a year ago now, might be a little over a year ago. But I share his story not only because I'm so proud of him and so proud of what the Lantos Foundation was able to be part of doing on his behalf, and that we actually had a victory. We got him free. We have to celebrate our victories when, a prisoner of conscience, somebody who's being mistreated is liberated, is freed. That's always cause for celebration. But to underscore the answer to your question, the lesson is that we do not turn our backs, whether it's Tutsis being massacred in a genocide in Rwanda, whether it is the Uyghurs in the Xinjiang region of China being subjected to a form of genocide, whether it is, the Christians in Nigeria who are facing ongoing threats and violence on just a shocking scale. We have to have that Wallenberg mindset. We have to say, these we share in common our shared humanity. These are my brothers and sisters. I'm not going to stand by and let them be otherized, let them be um, let them be persecuted, let them be pushed to the fringes, and let them be killed.
Well, thank you. I just want you to understand we get a little message from our audience, and sometimes it's so appropriate to the moment. Ileana Sechar has written in that her father-in-law, who was the head of the Hillel Foundation at the time, was the one who gave a visa to Tom Lantos, who was
Yes.
nobody in particular at the time. And so if you think about the question of what can we do,
Yeah.
there are things that, it's hard to imagine what a small act of
Yeah.
courage can do. And she reports that her parents also were Holocaust survivors, um, came to Israel, and it was difficult for them to speak about it because they had a sense of survivor's guilt. How did they survive
Yeah.
when others didn't? Which is
Let me
what
say thank you to Ileana. What a wonderful sort of special connection to make. And that's right, it was Hillel that gave my father the scholarship and visa to come study at the University of Washington. And yeah, he was definitely a nobody at that time. He was brilliant. He had greatness in him, as we all do, but had he not had that opportunity, it would not have come to fruition. And you say Ileana speaks about a kind of survivor's guilt. I think that's a very real thing. And and I think that it can be turned to good. It can be turned to good purposes. I certainly have seen that in the life of both of my parents. Um, they just felt a duty, an obligation. I'm not sure they would have called it guilt so much, but they knew that they had been given a chance to live, given a chance to come to a free and open and safe society, and that they had better do something with that opportunity that had been given to them. And as I say, in my father's case, he really did become in so many ways the conscience of the Congress. And so it yeah, thank you though for that comment.
would you like to comment on Deborah Littstadt and the Holocaust deniers? What, you know,
Yes, well, it's interesting because, of course, for a long time, and Deborah Lipstadt, she, um, in some senses, became very famous because she was willing to confront and take on a notorious Holocaust denier. I think in our day, we have perhaps less of an instance going on of Holocaust denial and more widespread Holocaust trivialization. This attempt to sort of say, well, yeah, maybe it happened, but that was a while ago. It's done. It wasn't that important. It wasn't as extensive. It wasn't as horrific. And so I do think that is another thing we need to be incredibly vigilant to. Another danger I think we're facing nowadays is the sort of completely legally unfounded and inaccurate um, sort of use of the term genocide for things where it has absolutely no applicability. We have, for example, the case of South Africa that has recently brought a sort of claim against Israel for genocide relative to the very, very difficult and inevitably tragic war that it has been forced to engage in as a result of the horrific and savage attacks of October 7th. War is terrible. Life is very imperfect, and the most imperfect thing perhaps about the lives we lead is war, which in its very premise is, you know, an acknowledgement of the failure of better ways to resolve things. Um, and with war always inevitably comes tragedy and tragic suffering by those who are not direct combatants in the war. But it is absurd in my view. And, you know, I'm a lawyer by training. I'm also, I teach human rights um, and, and foreign policy at Tufts University. Um, there is a profound lack of understanding of what the meaning of genocide is when people suggest that the very tragic casualties that we have seen in Gaza as a result of the war constitute genocide. Genocide is a very particular crime, international human rights crime, the gravest really that we can think of. And that is, it hinges entirely on the intent to destroy in whole or in part a community based on their religious identity or their national identity or some other of the qualifying characteristics. And you know, my heart breaks. I'm a mother and I'm a grandmother. My heart breaks for the children in Gaza, for the mothers in Gaza, for all the people suffering there, because there is definitely suffering going on. But not only is the war itself in no way a war of genocide, but I lay a tremendous amount of the responsibility for that suffering at the feet of Hamas, that uses their own civilians as human shields, that places their weapons and their fighters and their bombs and their rockets in schools, in houses, in hospitals, in mosques. All of these, of course, are war crimes. Um, that you know, that really utilize the tragic deaths of their own people as sort of another propaganda weapon in their genocidal war against the Jewish people and against the Jewish homeland. So these are very, very tough situations. It's very heartbreaking, but when you have a terror organization like Hamas that not only has as part of its charter the destruction of the national homeland of the Jewish people, but has said in the aftermath of 10/7, there will be more and more of these attacks. You know, this is the first, there will be more 10/7s. We will not stop until we have destroyed the state of Israel and the Jewish people. Then tragically, one has no choice but to fight against an enemy like that, and it's quite a tragedy for the Palestinian people that they too are victims of this terrible and genocidal terror group.
Well, Dr. Swett, you certainly have laid forth important history, and we appreciate your telling the story because we do believe that we should tell our stories and that the stories will inform us as we move forward. So as we come to our close of our time, perhaps I'd like you to comment as you're closing, what do you think is the message for today, for United States of America, and how we should move forward recognizing the Holocaust and determining that it will never happen again?
Well, let me first thank you, Jane, for this wonderful opportunity, and thank you to all of the participants. And I just put on the chat a moment ago, and you know, see some of the comments there, and I appreciate them all. I appreciate the wonderful comments of support, and I understand those who have tough questions. These are not easy times we're living in, and there are no easy answers. But I would say, Jane, I'm going to touch back again to Raoul Wallenberg, because there's a beautiful monument to Wallenberg in front of the United Nations. There's sort of an area where they have cobblestones from the Budapest ghetto. And sitting on those cobblestones is a bronze depiction of his briefcase with the letters RW for Raoul Wallenberg. And every time I see that memorial to Wallenberg, I get the impression, the sense of somebody who had to rush off in a great hurry to rescue someone so quickly that they left behind their briefcase. They couldn't be slowed down or stopped to pick it up or to sift through those important papers. And when I look at that briefcase on those cobblestones of the ghetto of Budapest, I hear the voice of Wallenberg saying to me, it's your responsibility now to pick up the suitcase, to pick up the work, to carry on what I started. And what did he start? He started, of course, a mission of rescue. It was very specific. It was very particular. Save these people before they can be killed, before they're deported to their deaths, before they're marched to their deaths, before they're taken to the banks of the Danube and shot and pushed into the river. But it was a bigger mission than even that incredibly powerful cause. It was the mission of recognizing our shared humanity, recognizing the fact that we are indeed responsible for one another. We are responsible for one another. And I would say to my country, to the members of Congress, to the people who form this great country of ours, that we have a duty to remember. We have a duty to pick up that briefcase, to go forward with the work of rescuing and protecting and defending. And we have a duty to live lives of service to others. So this very serious day of remembrance is also a day for us to commit and to strengthen and to increase our own determination to live lives that are worthy of those who went before.
Well, that is a powerful mission. Dr. Swett, you certainly have been gracious with your time, your talent. We really are so grateful. And we're grateful to all of those of you who have joined in and listened. This session has been recorded. It will be available on our YouTube channel. And so if you want to share it with your friends and neighbors, please do that. We are happy to have our work shared, and I believe that Dr. Swett would be happy to have her story shared widely.
Absolutely.
Over and over. And we also always at the conclusion remind our participants that these events are only available because of the support and contributions that come from our members and donors. And so we are so grateful to those of you who donate, who are members, who share the story. And we invite you to continue to learn our public history as we move forward and look about the upcoming events that we're about to show on the screen. We will be talking about, next week, we'll be talking about Mansfield and Dirksen, the bipartisan giants of the Senate. Now, this is, too often people say, how can politics work? Well, Senator Mansfield and Senator Dirksen show how that can work. And there's a new book out that is very compelling by Mark Johnson, and he will be with us to talk about that next week. And in our continuing series about the constitutional amendments, we are looking at the income tax, the 16th Amendment, the February 8th. And what was going on at the time that amendment was passed to the Constitution, and what does it mean for now? And then early in March, we turned to the last honest man, the CIA, the FBI, the mafia, and the Kennedys won senators' fight to save democracy. So we have a lot of conversation about how to save democracy. So join us for all of these upcoming events. We are grateful. We are grateful to you, Dr. Swett. We see that your beloved congressman has joined
Yes, yes,
one of
my husband.
one of our favorite volunteers. Thank you very much, Congressman Swett, for joining in to hear the good stories and for your work on behalf of the society. We are grateful to all of you. Be well. Have a great day. Everybody stay dry. Take care.
Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure and honor.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.